The rich husband thought he was in control, bringing his pregnant mistress to the family dinner, simply to humiliate his wife. But what he didn't know was that she had a revelation so devastating it made his heart race and ice run down his spine. The crystal champagne flute trembled slightly in Adeline Sterling's perfectly manicured hand. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a minor tremor, nothing worth noting at the black tie gala of Sterling Industries' quarterly investors' meeting. But Adeline knew her own body too well. Something was wrong. Her husband William's hand rested at the small of her back as they greeted New York's financial elite. But the pressure felt different tonight, distracted, performative. His eyes, usually locked on whoever he was charming, kept drifting to his phone, checking it with increasing frequency. "Darling, Senator Blackwood wants to discuss the new energy initiative," William whispered, his breath hot against her ear. His cologne, not his usual Clive Christian, lingered in her nostrils as he pulled away. "Keep the Goldmans entertained, will you? They're considering doubling their investment." Adeline's smile never faltered. "Of course." As William disappeared into the crowd of tuxedos and evening gowns, Adeline navigated toward the Goldmans with practiced grace. Her emerald green Valentino dress, the color carefully chosen to complement Sterling Industries' brand palette, whispered against the marble floor of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dender, which they had rented exclusively for the evening. "Eleanor, Richard, how wonderful to see you both," Adeline said, her voice perfectly modulated to convey both warmth and sophistication. "I trust the new portfolio adjustments have been satisfactory?" As Richard Goldman launched into market talk, Adeline performed her role flawlessly, while her mind worked on another problem entirely. 3 feet away, her husband's executive assistant, Vanessa, was frantically typing on her tablet, occasionally glancing up at William with a worried expression that didn't match the supposedly smooth operations of the evening. Eleanor Goldman touched Adeline's arm. "You've done wonders with the Sterling Foundation this year. The new children's hospital wing. I was moved to tears at the opening." "That's incredibly kind of you, Eleanor. The foundation means everything to me," Adeline replied, meaning it. The philanthropic arm of Sterling Industries had become her domain over the 10 years of her marriage, the one place where William gave her true autonomy. Across the room, William threw his head back in laughter at something the senator said, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. Adeline recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd worn 7 years ago when he orchestrated the hostile takeover of their biggest competitor, just before he fired everyone in the executive suite. "If you'll excuse me," Adeline said to the Goldmans, "I need to check on the silent auction. The Médecins Sans Frontières fundraising is tracking well above our goal." Breaking away, she moved not toward the auction displays, but to a quiet corridor where she could breathe. These events, the constant performance, the strategic conversations, the meticulous attention to every detail from her jewelry to her knowledge of each guest's children and portfolio preferences, had once energized her. Now they felt like slowly tightening handcuffs. 10 years ago, when she'd first met William Sterling at Columbia Business School, she couldn't have imagined this life. She'd been Adeline Hayes then, brilliant and ambitious, with a full scholarship and dreams of revolutionizing renewable energy financing. William had been the golden boy, 4th-generation Sterling, heir to an energy empire transitioning to green technology under his father's innovative vision. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. She still remembered their 3rd date, when he'd taken her to the Sterling Industries executive floor after hours. "One day, all of this will be mine," he'd told her, gesture encompassing the Manhattan skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. "And I want you beside me when it happens." 6 months later, they were engaged. Richard Sterling, William's father, had taken an immediate liking to her, appreciating her sharp mind and ethical approach to business. "You'll keep this company honest," he told her at their engagement party, his voice already weakened by the cancer that would take his life just 2 years later. The merger of their lives had seemed perfect, her intelligence and compassion complementing William's ruthless business acumen and family legacy. The New York Times business section had called them the Sterling Standard, the ideal power couple for a new generation of socially conscious capitalism. Adeline leaned against the cool marble wall away from prying eyes and allowed her mask to slip for just a moment. When had things begun to change? When had William's ambition curdled into something darker? Perhaps it was after his father died. Richard Sterling had been the moral compass of the company, insisting that their transition to renewable energy be genuine, not just a marketing ploy. William had grieved, certainly, but he'd also seemed relieved. Without his father's oversight, subtle changes began creeping into Sterling Industries' operations. Environmental compliance became a budget item to minimize. Community commitments became photo opportunities rather than substantive partnerships, and their marriage began changing too. Mrs. Sterling, Vanessa appeared at the end of the corridor, tablet clutched to her chest. The auction is closing in 20 minutes. Mr. Sterling thought you'd want to be present for the final bids. Thank you, Vanessa. Adeline straightened, mask back in place. Is everything all right? You seem concerned. The younger woman's eyes flickered with something, warning, fear, before her professional demeanor reasserted itself. Just the usual last-minute changes. Mr. Sterling has moved some meetings for tomorrow. Which meetings? Adeline asked, a coldness settling in her stomach. Your breakfast with the Sterling Foundation board has been postponed. Mr. Sterling needs the conference room for an urgent call with the Singapore investors. Singapore? There it was again. For 6 months, William had been taking mysterious calls with Singapore investors that appeared on no official Sterling Industries documents. Twice, Adeline had overheard fragments of these conversations, enough to know they weren't about renewable energy or any publicly acknowledged Sterling business. I see. Thank you for letting me know. Adeline moved to return to the gala, then paused. Vanessa, has Mr. Sterling changed his cologne? The assistant's cheeks flushed. I wouldn't know, Mrs. Sterling. But she did know. The slight tremble in Vanessa's voice confirmed what Adeline had begun suspecting 3 months ago, when William's late nights at the office became more frequent, when his phone began turning face down whenever she entered a room, when the scent of unfamiliar perfume clung faintly to his suits. At first, Adeline had dismissed her suspicions as paranoia. William wouldn't risk their marriage, or more importantly to him, the public image they'd cultivated so carefully. Sterling Industries' stock value was partially built on their perfect partnership, the brilliant, compassionate wife humanizing the ruthless CEO. The board of directors themselves had commented on how valuable their brand was to investor confidence, but the evidence had accumulated slowly, like a poison in her bloodstream. The Singapore calls, the changed passwords on his devices, the mysterious charges at boutique hotels charged to obscure subsidiary accounts that Adeline only found because she still had access codes from when she'd helped restructure the company's finance department after Richard's death. 2 weeks ago, she'd found the receipt for a Harry Winston bracelet she'd never received, purchased on the corporate card William used for business gifts. That night, she began making discreet preparations of her own. Returning to the gala, Adeline circulated with renewed purpose, her networking now focused on particular guests. Judge Harriman, whose wife served with Adeline on 3 charitable boards. Charles Winthrop, Sterling Industries' longtime legal counsel, who had been Richard Sterling's closest friend. Margaret Chen, their largest institutional investor, who had repeatedly expressed concerns about Sterling Industries' gradually shifting ethical positions. Adeline, darling, Margaret said, taking both her hands, that program you developed for transitioning coal communities to solar manufacturing is brilliant. When are you joining the executive team officially? The board would approve it in a heartbeat. You're too kind, Margaret. For now, I'm content with the foundation work. Adeline smiled, even as she registered William watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable. Though I have been reviewing the quarterly reports, I had some questions about the new Singapore venture. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. Singapore venture? That's not come before the board. My mistake, Adeline replied smoothly. I must have misunderstood something William mentioned. The evening continued its choreographed perfection, but now Adeline observed everything with heightened awareness. The way certain board members clustered around William, their expressions concerned. How William's chief financial officer, Marcus Webb, kept checking his watch, his usual unflappable demeanor showing cracks of anxiety. At precisely 10:30 p.m., William clinked his glass for attention. The crowd quieted as he stood on the small stage where the string quartet had been playing. Thank you all for coming tonight. Sterling Industries has always valued transparency with our investors and partners. William's voice carried confidence and authority across the room. As you know, our Q3 results exceeded projections by 18%. and our renewable portfolio now comprises 62% of our energy production. Applause rippled through the crowd. William's smile gleamed under the spotlights. Before we close this wonderful evening, I want to make a special announcement. His eyes found Adeline in the crowd. As many of you know, our annual Sterling Industries family dinner is next week, a tradition my father started to remind us that despite our global reach, we remain a family company at heart. Something in his gaze made Adeline's skin prickle. The triumph there wasn't about business. It was personal. This year's dinner will feature a special surprise that I believe signals an exciting new chapter for Sterling Industries and for the Sterling family itself. William raised his glass. To the future of Sterling Industries, may it always exceed expectations. As the crowd echoed his toast, Adeline maintained her perfect smile while her mind raced. William had never mentioned any surprise for the family dinner. More concerning was the glance that passed between him and Marcus Webb, a look that contained both apprehension and anticipation. When William rejoined her, his hand again finding the small of her back, he leaned down to whisper in her ear. His words were for her alone, his tone light, almost playful, but with an unmistakable edge of cruelty. I do hope you're not too attached to your seat at the head of the table, darling. It's time for some new blood in the Sterling family, don't you think? Adeline felt the floor tilt beneath her Jimmy Choos. For the first time in their decade together, William had miscalculated badly. He thought her greatest fear was losing her position, her status. He had never understood that what she valued was not power for its own sake, but the ability to ensure Sterling Industries lived up to its potential for positive impact. New blood sounds invigorating, she replied, her voice steady as she met his gaze directly. I look forward to seeing exactly what you have planned. William's smile flickered, perhaps detecting something unexpected in her response. But before he could reply, they were surrounded by departing guests offering congratulations on another successful event. As they bid farewell to the last of the investors, standing side by side like the perfect couple they pretended to be, Adeline made her decision. Whatever William had planned for the annual dinner, she would be ready, not just to defend herself, but to protect what Richard Sterling had entrusted to them both, a legacy that his son seemed determined to corrupt. The game was changing, and Adeline Sterling wasn't going to be just a pawn anymore. William had always underestimated her, seeing only the perfect corporate wife he had shaped. He'd never bothered to look deeper, to remember the brilliant strategist he'd fallen in love with at Columbia. That had been his first mistake. Now he was about to make another one. The Sterling family dining room, with its 20-foot ceilings and panoramic views of Central Park, had witnessed decades of power plays and corporate maneuvering disguised as family gatherings. Tonight's annual dinner was no exception, though Adeline suspected this particular evening would eclipse all previous Sterling drama. For the past week, she had methodically prepared for whatever surprise William planned to unveil. Her preparations included discreet meetings with Charles Winthrop, Sterling Industries' longtime legal counsel, and securing copies of key financial documents from the company archives. Documents that shouldn't exist, records of transactions through shell companies in Singapore, Panama, and the Cayman Islands. As she arranged the final place settings, Limoges china on Flemish lace tablecloths, each setting accented with arrangements of white orchids, Adeline couldn't help but appreciate the irony. William had always insisted these dinners remain in their home rather than a restaurant, ostensibly to maintain the family business atmosphere Richard Sterling had valued. In reality, it was because William preferred conducting his power plays on territory he controlled. Mrs. Sterling, the first guests have arrived, announced Harriet, their housekeeper of 8 years. Thank you, Harriet. I'll be right there. Adeline smoothed down her Chanel dress, navy blue, conservative but impeccably tailored, and touched the pearl necklace that had belonged to Richard Sterling's mother. A deliberate choice for tonight, a reminder of legacy. In the foyer, Marcus Webb and his wife Claire were handing their coats to the staff. As chief financial officer, Marcus was William's right hand in all Sterling operations, legitimate and otherwise. Adeline, you look radiant as always, Claire gushed, air-kissing both cheeks. The house is stunning, Marcus added, though his eyes darted nervously around the space, clearly looking for William. He's running slightly late, Adeline said, answering the unasked question. Something about finalizing details for his surprise announcement. Marcus's expression tightened momentarily before he forced a smile. Yes, big night for Sterling Industries. Indeed, Adeline replied, her tone pleasant, but her eyes sharp. A watershed moment, I believe. The slight flinch in Marcus's posture confirmed what she'd suspected. He knew exactly what William planned, and he was uncomfortable with it. Good. She could use that. Over the next half hour, the remaining guests arrived. Victoria Sterling, William's widowed mother, a woman whose icy demeanor had softened toward Adeline only after she'd proven her value to the Sterling Empire. James and Catherine Sterling, William's brother and sister-in-law who ran the European operations. Elizabeth Chen, daughter of Margaret Chen and newly appointed to the board of directors. Judge Howard Harriman and his wife Beatrice, and several other key executives and family members. No sign of the man of the hour? James asked, accepting a glass of scotch from the bartender Adeline had hired for the evening. I'm sure William is making an entrance, Victoria commented dryly. At 72, she remained a formidable presence, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her posture military straight. You know William, Adeline replied with a practiced laugh. He does love his dramatic timing. The group moved to the living room for pre-dinner drinks, the conversation flowing around topics carefully selected to avoid anything too controversial. The latest exhibition at the Whitney, the performance of various prep schools where their children were enrolled, the unseasonably warm October weather. Adeline circulated with practiced ease, all while keeping one eye on the entrance. Unlike the anxious Marcus, she wasn't watching for William. She was calculating what form his surprise would take. The answer came at 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes past the scheduled dinner time. The elevator doors opened and William strode in, his custom Tom Ford suit impeccable as always. But he wasn't alone. A collective hush fell over the room as a young woman stepped out behind him. She was perhaps 25, with glossy chestnut hair and delicate features. Her black dress was expensive but tasteful, clearly chosen to downplay rather than emphasize her very visible pregnancy. At least 6 months along, Adeline estimated clinically. William's smile contained equal parts triumph and malice as he guided the woman forward with his hand at the small of her back, the same proprietary gesture he used with Adeline at public events. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Madison Pierce, William announced, his voice carrying that practiced warmth he reserved for board meetings and press conferences. Madison is heading our new Special Projects Division and will be joining our family in more ways than one. His hand moved to rest briefly on Madison's rounded belly. As you can see, the silence that followed was absolute. Even Victoria Sterling, who prided herself on being unshockable, stared open-mouthed at her son. Adeline felt all eyes shift toward her, awaiting the inevitable breakdown. The humiliated wife publicly displaced by a younger model carrying the air that she and William had never produced. It was a scene designed for maximum devastation, not just to her dignity, but to her position within Sterling Industries. For a fraction of a second, Adeline allowed herself to feel the full force of the betrayal, not just of their marriage, but of everything she'd built at Sterling. The rage burned white-hot through her veins, then cooled instantly into something far more dangerous: clarity. William had orchestrated this moment expecting tears, shock, a public meltdown that would justify whatever came next, her removal from the foundation, divorce proceedings that would minimize her settlement, perhaps even questions about her mental stability. He'd chosen the annual family dinner deliberately, surrounding her with people whose loyalties lay with the Sterling name, not with her. What he'd forgotten was who he married. Adeline moved forward, her smile warm and unwavering as she approached Madison directly. How wonderful to finally meet you, Madison. William has been so mysterious lately. Now I understand why. Madison's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting this reception. Up close, Adeline could see the young woman's discomfort, the slight tremor in her hand as she accepted Adeline's extended one. Mrs. Sterling, Madison began, her voice soft with a slight southern accent. Please, it's Adeline, she interrupted gently. After all, we're going to be family, aren't we? Turning to the stunned room, Adeline continued, Shall we move to dinner? Chef has prepared something special tonight and I'd hate for it to get cold. William's expression flickered between confusion and annoyance as Adeline took Madison's arm and guided her toward the dining room. This clearly wasn't the script he'd prepared for. You're not upset? Madison whispered, barely audible. We'll have plenty of time to discuss everything, Adeline replied quietly. But right now you look like you could use a comfortable seat and perhaps some water instead of wine. As they entered the dining room, Adeline made a swift decision. "Madison, why don't you sit here beside me? I've always found this chair has the best support for the lower back." It was her own chair, at the opposite end of the table from William, a power position, and by placing Madison beside her rather than next to William, she was sending a clear message to everyone present. She wasn't relinquishing control of this narrative. William's jaw tightened as he took in the new seating arrangement, but he could hardly object without looking petty. The other guests filed in silently, the tension so thick it seemed to alter the room's gravity. "Well, this is certainly a surprise," Victoria finally said as the first course was served. Her tone could have frozen nitrogen. "William, perhaps you might enlighten us on how long this arrangement has been in place." William smiled, regaining his equilibrium. "Madison and I have been working closely together for nearly a year on some exciting new ventures. How a personal relationship developed naturally from there." He raised his wine glass. "Sometimes the most valuable partnerships arise from unexpected places." "How interesting," Adeline commented, her voice pleasant. "I wasn't aware we had a special projects division. Which department does it fall under, Marcus?" Marcus Webb nearly choked on his wine. "It's a direct report to the CEO's office, still in development stages." "Fascinating," Elizabeth Chen interjected, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "As a board member, I'm curious why this division hasn't appeared in any of our organizational briefings." William smiled tightly. "It's been handled with discretion due to the competitive nature of the projects. I plan to present a full brief at the next board meeting." "We look forward to it," Elizabeth replied, exchanging a quick glance with Adeline. As the dinner progressed through its courses, the initial shock gave way to an elaborate dance of questions and deflections. William, recovering from Adeline's unexpected composure, began extolling Madison's credentials: Wharton MBA, experience at a boutique consulting firm, specialized knowledge in emerging markets. Madison herself said little, occasionally answering direct questions with soft-spoken intelligence that suggested she was indeed qualified for some executive role. But Adeline noticed how the young woman's eyes kept darting between her and William, as if trying to decode the invisible power struggle playing out across the hand-knotted Persian carpet. "And how are you finding New York, Madison?" Adeline asked, during a lull in conversation. William mentioned a southern accent. "Georgia, perhaps." "South Carolina," Madison corrected, looking surprised that Adeline had picked up on it. "Charleston. And New York is overwhelming sometimes, but exciting." "I felt the same way when I first arrived for business school," Adeline said warmly. "If you ever need a guide to the city's quieter corners, I'd be happy to show you around. There are some lovely prenatal yoga studios in the village that helped several of my friends through their pregnancies." This direct acknowledgement of the pregnancy, offered as friendly support rather than confrontation, sent another ripple of tension through the table. William's expression darkened momentarily. "That's very kind," Madison murmured, her discomfort visibly increasing. "When is the baby due?" Victoria asked bluntly. "January," Madison replied, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. "A New Year's baby," Adeline commented. "How appropriate for new beginnings." The conversation shifted to safer topics through the main course, though the undercurrents remained. James Sterling kept shooting concerned glances at Adeline, while Catherine engaged Madison in gentle conversation about pregnancy symptoms and nursery preparations. Judge Harriman and Marcus Webb flanked William, their hushed conversation occasionally punctuated by furtive glances around the table. By the time dessert was served, Adeline could sense William's growing frustration. His planned spectacle had failed to produce the desired effect. Instead of collapsing under the humiliation, she had somehow managed to position herself as the magnanimous figure in this tableau, leaving him looking increasingly petty and Madison increasingly uncomfortable. "Before we finish this lovely evening," William said as coffee was poured, "I wanted to share some additional news." He straightened, reclaiming the authoritative posture that served him so well in boardrooms. "Given the coming changes to our family structure, Adeline and I have been discussing her role moving forward. We both feel it makes sense for her to step back from certain Sterling Industries responsibilities to focus on her personal interests." And there it was, the second part of his plan, using Madison and the baby as justification for pushing Adeline out of the company entirely. "How thoughtful of you, William," Adeline replied, setting down her coffee cup with a soft clink against the saucer. "Though I don't recall that particular conversation." A dangerous flash crossed William's eyes. Perhaps not in those exact words, darling, but we've often discussed how stretched thin you've been between the foundation and your board commitments. Actually, Adeline said, rising gracefully to her feet and lifting her water glass, I've been considering my role at Sterling Industries quite deeply lately. The room stilled, everyone's attention fixed on her. This was the moment William had been waiting for, the emotional breakdown, the public concession of defeat. Instead, Adeline smiled and looked around the table, making eye contact with each person present. I'd like to propose a toast to Sterling Industries and to the legacy that Richard Sterling created, a legacy of innovation, integrity, and impact. Several people murmured in agreement, raising their glasses. William's expression remained wary. Richard once told me that a company is only as strong as its moral foundation, Adeline continued. That profit without purpose is empty, and growth without governance is dangerous. She turned her gaze directly to William. I've always taken those words seriously, perhaps more seriously than some realized. She raised her glass higher. To new beginnings indeed, and to the truth, which has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it's buried. The toast hung in the air, loaded with meaning that few present fully understood. Yet, William's knuckles had turned white around his wine stem, his smile frozen in place as he tried to decipher the threat beneath her words. Madison Pierce, watching this exchange with wide eyes, slowly raised her water glass. To the truth, she echoed softly, her gaze meeting Adeline's with something that might have been understanding or warning. As glasses clinked around the table, Adeline retook her seat, outwardly serene while her mind raced with the next steps in a plan that had been accelerated by tonight's events. William clearly intended to move faster than she'd anticipated, which meant she needed to do the same. Now, she said brightly, as if the loaded exchange had never happened, who would like coffee? And Madison, I have some wonderful herbal tea that's perfect for expectant mothers. The battle lines had been drawn. William had made his move, expecting a swift victory. Instead, he'd encountered a resistance he never anticipated from the wife he'd underestimated for far too long. The game was just beginning. The morning after the disastrous family dinner, Adeline woke before dawn. While William slept in the guest bedroom, an arrangement that had become increasingly common over the past year, she slipped into her home office and locked the door. From a hidden compartment in her desk drawer, she retrieved a small leather-bound notebook. Inside were dates, times and locations scrawled in her precise handwriting, a record of William's increasingly suspicious activities over the past 8 months. What had begun as intuition about her husband's infidelity had evolved into something far more concerning when she accidentally glimpsed an email about alternative revenue streams and regulatory blind spots in Singapore. Adeline hadn't become the perfect corporate wife by being naive. The Sterling name carried weight because of its reputation for ethical leadership in the energy transition space. If William was engaging in something that required hiding from regulators, it threatened not just their marriage, but the entire foundation of what Richard Sterling had built. At precisely 7:15 a.m., she sent a text message to a number saved under Pilates instructor, coffee at the usual place. 8:30. 45 minutes later, dressed in workout clothes with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, Adeline entered a small cafe in the West Village, far from the Manhattan power circles where she might be recognized. In the back corner, a distinguished older man in a casual sweater waited, a chessboard set up on the table before him. "Good morning, Charles," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Charles Winthrop, Sterling Industries' longtime legal counsel and Richard Sterling's closest friend, moved a chess piece before responding. "Your move, my dear, both on the board and in real life, it seems." Williams accelerating his timeline, he brought Madison to the family dinner last night. Charles's bushy eyebrows rose. Bold, even for William. "She's pregnant, due in January." "Ah." The older lawyer leaned back, processing this new information. "That explains his sudden interest in reviewing the company's succession policies." Adeline's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "He's planning to remove me entirely. He announced it at dinner, said I'd be stepping back from Sterling Industries." Charles made a disapproving sound. "Richard would be furious. He always said you were the best thing that ever happened to that company, and to his son." "Richard isn't here," Adeline said quietly. "And William has been systematically dismantling his father's legacy for years. The Singapore operation is just the latest example." Charles glanced around the cafe before leaning forward. I've reviewed those documents you sent me. If what you've found is accurate, William has been funneling sterling funds through at least 3 shell companies. The environmental compliance reports for the Indonesian projects appear to have been falsified as well. They were falsified, Adeline confirmed. I spoke with Dr. Eliza Watkins last week, the environmental scientist who conducted the original impact studies. She says the reports submitted to the Indonesian government bear her signature, but the data has been altered. The actual contamination levels are far higher than reported. Charles's expression grew grave. That's criminal activity, Adeline, not just corporate malfeasance. I know. She moved a chess piece. Check. What's your next move? I need to see Richard's will again. The original document, not the summary William provided to the family. Charles studied her carefully. May I ask why? Because Richard Sterling was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. He would never have left his company vulnerable to someone who might compromise its values. The will is sealed in the company vault. Only William has access now. Adeline smiled thinly. Not quite true. Victoria has access as well. And Victoria owes me a favor after I kept quiet about her little incident with prescription medications last year. Charles looked impressed despite himself. You've been planning this for some time. I've been gathering information. There's a difference. She paused, then added quietly, I loved him, Charles. I wanted to be wrong. The old lawyer's eyes softened. I know, my dear. Richard knew it too. It's why he trusted you so much. He moved his king out of check. Your move. 3 hours later, Adeline sat in Victoria Sterling's penthouse on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by priceless antiques and the suffocating scent of tuberose that her mother-in-law favored. I must say, I'm impressed by your composure last night, Victoria said, pouring tea from a Sèvres porcelain set. Most women would have caused a scene. I'm not most women, Adeline replied, which is why Richard valued my presence in William's life. Victoria's perfectly maintained face registered surprise at this direct approach. My husband had great affection for you, yes, and concern for his company's future. Adeline set down her teacup. Victoria, I need to see Richard's original will, not the version William presented to the board. The older woman went still. What makes you think there's a difference? Because I knew your husband. And because William has been systematically redirecting sterling resources into questionable ventures that Richard would never have approved. Victoria studied her for a long moment. You're talking about Singapore. Now it was Adeline's turn to be surprised. You know, I may be relegated to the role of family matriarch now, but I was Richard's partner for 40 years. I know when numbers don't add up. Victoria set down her cup with a decisive click. What exactly are you planning, Adeline? To protect Sterling Industries' legacy and possibly save your son from himself. After another long assessment, Victoria rose and walked to a painting, a Monet that Adeline had always admired. She swung it forward, revealing a small wall safe. After entering a combination, she removed a sealed envelope. Richard left this with me for safekeeping. He said if William ever began to prioritize profit over principle, I should ensure this found its way to the right hands. She held the envelope out to Adeline. I believe those hands are yours. Inside was a legal codicil to Richard's will, properly notarized and dated 1 week before his death. As Adeline read it, her breath caught. He created a special class of voting shares, she murmured. Dual control between William and the Sterling Foundation, Victoria finished. Which is under your exclusive direction. Richard never fully trusted William's moral compass. He built in a safeguard. Adeline looked up, mind racing with implications. William doesn't know about this. No. And he's been running the company as if he has unilateral authority. Any major decisions made without proper dual approval could be invalidated. Victoria's smile was sharp. Including, I imagine, this special projects division he's created for his pregnant mistress. The Sterling Foundation offices occupied the 42nd floor of Sterling Tower, deliberately positioned directly below the executive suite where William worked. As Adeline entered through the private elevator that afternoon, her assistant Meredith hurried toward her. Mrs. Sterling, you have a visitor waiting in your office. She wouldn't give her name but insisted it was urgent. Adeline's steps faltered when she opened her office door to find Madison Pierce perched nervously on the edge of a visitor's chair, hands protectively cradling her pregnant belly. Madison, this is unexpected. The younger woman stood awkwardly. I hope I'm not intruding. I needed to speak with you alone. Adeline closed the door and gestured for Madison to retake her seat. I think that's wise. There's clearly much we need to discuss. First, I want to apologize for last night, Madison blurted. I never wanted... That is, William said you knew about us, that you had an arrangement. Did he now? Adeline's voice remained calm as she took her seat behind the desk. And what else has William told you? Madison shifted uncomfortably. That you were stepping away from Sterling Industries to pursue other interests. That you'd grown apart years ago but maintained appearances for business reasons. I see. And your position as head of special projects, was that also part of our supposed arrangement? A flush crept up Madison's neck. He said you approved it, that you recognized my qualifications would benefit the company. Interesting, considering I've never seen your resume. Adeline leaned forward. Madison, I don't believe you came here to repeat William's lies. What do you really want? The younger woman's composure cracked. Protection. For my baby and myself. Protection from what? From William. Madison's voice dropped to a whisper. He's not who I thought he was when this started. The things he's asked me to do, the documents he's had me sign. Adeline's interest sharpened. What documents? Madison reached into her handbag and pulled out a flash drive. Financial authorizations for companies I've never heard of. Backdated contracts. Environmental compliance certificates that I'm supposedly qualified to verify, though I have no scientific background. Her hands trembled. When I questioned him, he said it was all standard business practice, but you're smart enough to recognize fraud when you see it, Adeline finished. Why are you bringing this to me? Why not go to the authorities? Because my signature is on those documents, Madison said, her eyes filling with tears. I could go to jail. And my baby. She placed the flash drive on the desk. William said you're soft, that you care more about doing good than doing business. I'm hoping that means you'll help me. Adeline studied the young woman before her. The vulnerability seemed genuine, but she'd been fooled before. What exactly are you proposing? I'll testify to everything I know about William's operations. In exchange, I want immunity and protection for my child. Madison straightened her shoulders. I made a terrible mistake getting involved with him, but I won't let my baby pay for it. And if I refuse, then I take my chances with the FBI. At least then I'd have tried to make things right. Adeline picked up the flash drive, considering her options. Madison could be telling the truth, or this could be an elaborate trap orchestrated by William to catch her investigating him. I'll need time to verify this information, she finally said, and I'll need your complete cooperation. Madison nodded eagerly. Anything you need. Start by telling me everything you know about Singapore. By late afternoon, William had begun to sense something was wrong. His calls to Madison went straight to voicemail. The preliminary paperwork he'd sent to remove Adeline from the Sterling Foundation board remained unacknowledged, and most concerning of all, Elizabeth Chen had requested an urgent meeting to discuss governance concerns ahead of next week's board session. When his private elevator opened directly into his penthouse office suite, he was surprised to find James waiting for him. Bit early for a family visit, isn't it? William said, tossing his suit jacket over a chair. His brother didn't smile. What the hell are you doing, Will? You'll need to be more specific. Madison Pierce, the pregnancy? Ambushing your wife at the family dinner? James counted off on his fingers. And now I hear rumors you're trying to push Adeline out of the foundation. Have you lost your mind? William poured himself a scotch. My personal life is my business. As for the foundation, Adeline's time is better spent elsewhere now that we're restructuring. Restructuring without board approval? James crossed his arms. Dad would be ashamed. Dad's dead, William snapped, and I'm running this company now. We can't afford to waste resources on feel-good projects that don't generate revenue. The foundation isn't a feel-good project. It's central to our corporate identity, and Adeline has leveraged it to open markets we couldn't otherwise access. William waved dismissively. Markets with minimal returns and maximum regulatory headaches. The real money is in Singapore and Indonesia now. James frowned. Those operations aren't even in our quarterly reports. They're still in development. You'll be briefed when necessary. Like how Adeline will be briefed on her own removal? James shook his head. You're making a mistake, Will. Adeline isn't just your wife. She's respected throughout the industry. The board trusts her. Investors trust her. They trust the Sterling name, William corrected. which will soon be carried by my child with Madison, not by a woman who couldn't even fulfill the basic duty of providing an heir. The slap of the door was his only warning before Adeline's voice cut through the room like ice. Is that what this is about? My failure to produce a sterling heir? Both men turned to see her standing in the doorway, her expression composed, but her eyes blazing. Adeline, William recovered quickly, we were just discussing foundation matters. No, you were discussing my removal and my apparent reproductive shortcomings. She stepped into the room, nodding to James. Would you excuse us? My husband and I need to talk. James glanced between them, clearly uncomfortable. Are you sure? Quite sure, Adeline replied. This won't take long. After James's reluctant departure, William leaned against his desk with practiced casualness. Come to accept the inevitable, darling? On the contrary, I've come to give you one chance to salvage what's left of your father's legacy, and possibly your freedom. William's smile faltered. What are you talking about? Singapore, Indonesia, the falsified environmental reports, the offshore accounts. Adeline approached his desk and set down a thick folder. Shall I continue? For a moment, genuine shock registered on William's face before his expression hardened. You've been spying on me? I've been protecting Sterling Industries from its greatest threat, you. She opened the folder, revealing printed financial statements. 3 shell companies in Singapore. Bribes to Indonesian officials disguised as consulting fees. Environmental data systematically falsified to hide contamination levels that would trigger mandatory shutdowns. William's eyes darted to the statements, then back to her face. You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I? Madison was quite thorough in her explanation earlier today. That visibly rattled him. Madison came to you? With a conscience far cleaner than yours, it seems. Adeline closed the folder. Your father suspected you might one day prioritize profit over principle. That's why he created a safeguard in his will, a codicil establishing dual control of Sterling Industries between you and the Foundation. The color drained from William's face. You're lying. The codicil has been with your mother all these years. The special voting shares he created give the Foundation, which I control, equal authority on all major corporate decisions. She smiled thinly. Including personnel changes, including new divisions for pregnant mistresses. William lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Where is it? What have you done? Adeline looked pointedly at his hand until he released her. It's somewhere safe, as is Madison, as is all the evidence of your fraud. You wouldn't dare expose this, he hissed. It would destroy Sterling Industries. Your precious foundation would collapse. Not if the board acts swiftly to remove the source of corruption and implement proper controls. She stepped back, straightening her jacket. You have until tomorrow morning to resign as CEO and transfer all operational control to the interim leadership committee I've already discussed with key board members. William's laugh was ugly. You really think the board will choose you over me? I'm a Sterling by blood. You're just the barren wife I'm replacing. No, William, I'm the woman your father trusted to preserve his real legacy. Integrity. She moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and you should know, Madison has agreed to testify about everything in exchange for immunity. The real question is whether you'll be facing civil penalties or criminal charges. As she reached for the door handle, William called after her, desperation edging into his voice. What do you want, Adeline? Money? Your position at the Foundation guaranteed? Name your price? She turned back, her expression almost pitying. That's always been your mistake, William. Believing everything and everyone has a price. She opened the door. Some things are simply priceless, like integrity, like legacy, like justice. Adeline walked out, closing the door firmly behind her. In her hand was a flash drive containing everything she needed: financial records, falsified reports, and Madison's sworn statement detailing William's instructions to facilitate fraud across multiple jurisdictions. The Sterling Empire was about to undergo its most significant transition since Richard's death, and this time, it would be guided by the values its founder had always intended, with or without his son at the helm. The next morning, Adeline's private line rang at 5:17 a.m. Charles Winthrop's voice was tight with urgency. They're moving against you. William called an emergency executive committee meeting for 7 a.m. Adeline sat up in bed, instantly alert. On what grounds? Mental health concerns. He's claiming you've become paranoid and unstable. making wild accusations due to emotional distress over his new relationship. She almost laughed at the predictability. Let me guess, he has a psychiatric evaluation to support this claim. From Dr. Philip Morrow, Charles confirmed. Backdated to make it appear you've been under observation for months. Dr. Morrow, the same psychiatrist who had conveniently declared Richard Sterling competent to sign revised business documents while heavily medicated during his final weeks. William was recycling old tactics. Who's attending this meeting? The inner circle only. Marcus Webb, James, Victoria, and 3 board members loyal to William. Adeline was already moving to her closet, phone pressed to her ear. Is Elizabeth Chen invited? No, nor Judge Harriman. William's being selective. As expected. She pulled out a charcoal Armani suit, battle armor for what was coming. Are you still at the office? Yes, I've been reviewing those documents all night. Adeline, it's worse than we thought. The Singapore operation isn't just about tax evasion. They're laundering money for a mining consortium with ties to organized crime. Her hand froze on a silk blouse. Are you certain? The money trail is unmistakable. If this goes public, we're looking at criminal charges that could bring down the entire company. Adeline closed her eyes briefly. We need to move faster than planned. Can you meet me at Madison's hotel in 30 minutes? The Carlisle. I'll be there. As she dressed, Adeline's mind raced through contingencies. William wouldn't stop at having her declared unstable. That was merely the opening move. Once he successfully removed her from her position, he would ensure she had no access to company documents or allies. Then would come the more permanent solutions, forced psychiatric care perhaps, or manufactured evidence of wrongdoing on her part. Richard Sterling's codicil was her strongest protection, but even that required board recognition to be effective. If William convinced enough board members that she was mentally unfit, the codicil might be challenged or ignored until a lengthy legal battle resolved its validity. Time was not on her side. Madison Pierce opened her hotel room door wearing silk pajamas, her hair disheveled from sleep but her eyes alert with fear. He knows, doesn't he? She asked immediately, ushering Adeline and Charles inside. William called me 6 times last night. He left messages saying he knows we met. He suspects, but he doesn't know what evidence you've provided, Adeline said, setting her briefcase on the small dining table. We need to move you somewhere safer. Madison unconsciously placed a protective hand over her belly. He said he'd make sure I never saw my baby if I betrayed him. That's not going to happen, Adeline said firmly. Charles, what's our best option? The lawyer pulled out his phone. I have a house in Connecticut that no one knows about. It's under a shell corporation I created years ago for a client who needed privacy during a high-profile divorce. William would never connect it to me. Will that be enough? Madison asked, her voice trembling slightly. You don't know how far he'll go. Adeline studied the younger woman, seeing genuine terror in her eyes. You're right. I probably don't know everything he's capable of. Why don't you tell me? Madison sank onto the edge of the bed. I thought he was just ambitious at first. Cutting corners to maximize profits didn't seem so terrible. Everyone does it, right? She laughed bitterly. Then I saw what happened to people who questioned him. His former VP of operations, David Mercer. William didn't just fire him for raising concerns about the Indonesia project. He manufactured evidence of embezzlement. David can't get hired anywhere now. Charles nodded grimly. Richard would never have tolerated such tactics. William told me his father was weak, Madison continued. That Richard could have built Sterling Industries into something 10 times larger if he hadn't been so obsessed with ethical considerations. He said the company needed a Sterling who wasn't afraid to do what was necessary. Her eyes met Adeline's. He talked about you too. I'm sure he did. He said you were useful as the company's public face, the compassionate, ethical side that customers and investors love to see, but that behind closed doors, you were a hindrance to real progress. Adeline's smile was tight. Translation, I wouldn't look the other way when he started dismantling his father's ethical safeguards. There's more, Madison said, her voice dropping. He has a plan to remove you completely, not just from the company but from his life. Divorce, you mean? Madison hesitated, her expression troubled. I don't think it's just divorce he's planning. A heavy silence filled the room as the implications settled. Charles cleared his throat. All the more reason to act quickly. Madison, pack what you need. My driver will take you to Connecticut while we deal with William. As Madison gathered her things, Adeline sat at the small desk, reviewing the documents they'd compiled. She paused at a transaction record showing $12 million transferred from Sterling subsidiaries to a company called Azure Horizon Limited. Charles, what do we know about Azure Horizon? The lawyer looked up from his phone. Not much. It's registered in the Cayman Islands. Appeared about 8 months ago. Why? Adeline tapped the document. These transfers are coded as security consulting, but they're oddly structured, small enough to avoid triggering automatic regulatory reviews, but frequent, and they started exactly when William began pushing for control of our Indonesian operations. Madison froze in the act of folding a sweater. Azure Horizon, she repeated. I've heard that name. William had me sign authorization for payments to them just last week. Did he explain what they do? He said they were specialists who ensured our Indonesian operations ran smoothly. Her eyes widened with sudden understanding. Oh, God. They're fixers, aren't they? People who handle problems? Charles moved to examine the documents. These payment structures are consistent with how corporations typically funnel money to private security firms that operate in legal gray areas, the kind that provide solutions to regulatory or personnel issues. A chill ran through Adeline. William wasn't just committing financial fraud. He was potentially involved with people who solved problems permanently. We need to make copies of everything, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. And we need to get Madison out of here now. 3 hours later, with Madison safely on her way to Connecticut with armed private security Charles had arranged, Adeline strode into Sterling Tower. She had deliberately bypassed the emergency meeting William had called, instead going directly to Elizabeth Chen's office on the 38th floor. Elizabeth, the newest and youngest board member, had been Margaret Chen's choice to represent their family's substantial investment in Sterling Industries. At 34, she had already earned a reputation as a financial prodigy with an unwavering ethical compass. This is quite the morning, Elizabeth said, gesturing Adeline to a seat. William has been calling every board member claiming you've had some kind of breakdown. He's even sent a formal recommendation for a medical leave of absence. I imagine he has, Adeline replied, opening her portfolio. Before we discuss that, I'd like to show you something. For the next 40 minutes, Adeline methodically laid out the evidence of William's financial malfeasance, from the Singapore shell companies to the Indonesian environmental fraud. She concluded with Richard Sterling's codicil establishing dual control of the company. Elizabeth listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Adeline finished, she leaned back in her chair. If even half of this is true, Sterling Industries is facing an existential crisis. Yes, which is why I'm coming to you first. Before taking this to the full board, your family's investment in Sterling is substantial, and your mother has always valued ethical governance above all else. Elizabeth tapped her pen against her desk, thinking, William will claim these documents are fake, that you've manufactured evidence due to emotional distress over his new relationship. He will. And the pregnant girlfriend? She's willing to testify against him? She is. She's afraid of what he might do when he realizes the extent of her cooperation. Based on these payments to Azure Horizon, her fear seems justified. Elizabeth set down her pen decisively. I need to call my mother. While Elizabeth conferred with Margaret Chen, Adeline received a text from Charles. William looking for you everywhere. Security has been instructed to escort you to his office on site, claiming medical concern, followed by another. Judge Harriman reviewing codicil. Says legally sound, but William filing emergency injunction, claiming you obtained it fraudulently. William was moving quickly, using every resource at his disposal to neutralize her before she could present her evidence to the board. Elizabeth ended her call and turned to Adeline with newfound determination. My mother agrees we need to act immediately. The Chen family's support alone isn't enough, though. We need more board members on our side before the emergency meeting William has called for 2 p.m. today. Who can we count on? Judge Harriman is a definite ally. James might support you over William, especially if Victoria does. That gives us 4 votes, including mine. We need 7 for a majority, Adeline calculated, and William already has 3 in his pocket. 4 or 5, most likely, Elizabeth corrected. He's been cultivating relationships with the newer board members for months. Private dinners, golf outings, investment tips. Adeline's phone buzzed with another text. W claiming codicil invalidated by subsequent agreement R signed before death. Producing document now. Need original copy of codicil immediately. The walls were closing in. William was creating documentation to counter every move she made. "I need to get to Victoria," Adeline said, standing. "She has the original codicil." "How, you can't go yourself," Elizabeth warned. "Security will intercept you." "Then we need someone William wouldn't suspect." Adeline hesitated, then made a decision. "Can you reach James Sterling directly, without William knowing?" By noon, Adeline had established a temporary command center in Charles Winthrop's private law office, 12 blocks from Sterling Tower. James Sterling arrived looking harried, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. "This better be good, Adeline. I just walked out of a meeting with William and the executive committee where they were discussing your mental health treatment options. Did they vote on anything?" "Not yet. William wanted to, but Mother insisted we needed more information from medical professionals." James loosened his tie. "She's stalling for you, though I don't think she realizes it." "She knows exactly what she's doing," Adeline replied. "Did you bring what I asked for?" James produced a sealed envelope from his inner suit pocket. "Mother said to tell you she's sorry she didn't give you this sooner. She thought William would eventually grow into the man Dad believed he could be." Inside was the original codicil to Richard Sterling's will, along with a handwritten letter addressed to Adeline. "My dear Adeline, if you're reading this, then my son has forced a choice between family loyalty and company integrity. I have always believed that William's brilliant mind would eventually be tempered by the wisdom that comes with responsibility. If Victoria has given you this letter, then that hope has proven false. The enclosed documents place Sterling Industries' future in your hands as much as William's. Use this power wisely, not for vengeance but for stewardship of what our company can mean to the world. With faith in your judgment." Richard Sterling. Adeline folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope, emotion threatening to break through her composed exterior. Richard had trusted her with his life's work. She would not fail him now. "James, I need to know where you stand," she said, facing her brother-in-law directly. Not as William's brother, but as a Sterling Industries executive and board member. James ran a hand through his hair, conflict evident on his face. "I love my brother, Adeline, but if what you're showing me is true, these offshore accounts, the environmental fraud, this isn't just about family drama. It's criminal." "It is," Charles confirmed, spreading additional documents across the conference table. "The Indonesian environmental data alone constitutes criminal fraud. If these toxicity levels were accurately reported, the entire operation would be shut down immediately." James studied the figures, his expression darkening. "Are these surrounding communities? People are getting sick, aren't they?" "According to the original testing data that Madison provided, yes. Significantly increased rates of respiratory illness and skin conditions consistent with chemical exposure." The conflict on James's face resolved into determination. William crossed a line. Dad would never have allowed this. "Then help us stop it," Adeline said. "The board meeting is in 2 hours. William believes he has the votes to remove me and suppress all this evidence. What do you need me to do?" At 1:45 p.m., Adeline sat alone in Charles's office, reviewing her presentation for the board one final time. James had returned to Sterling Tower to coordinate with Elizabeth and Judge Harriman. Victoria had confirmed her possession of additional documentation proving the authenticity of Richard's codicil. All the pieces were in place. Her phone rang, an unknown number. "Adeline Sterling. Mrs. Sterling, this is Detective Frank Morgan, NYPD Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling regarding some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention concerning your activities at Sterling Industries." Her blood ran cold. "What allegations would those be, Detective?" "Embezzlement, fraud, and falsification of corporate records. We have a warrant for your financial documents and electronic devices. Officers are currently at your residence and at Sterling Tower with the necessary paperwork." William had escalated beyond corporate maneuvering to legal action, a bold move using his connections with local authorities to neutralize her before the board meeting. "I see," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "And who exactly brought these allegations to your attention?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss that, ma'am. I need to know your current location so officers can serve you with the warrant directly." "Of course, Detective. I'm currently with my attorney, Charles Winthrop, at his offices. We'll be happy to cooperate fully with your investigation." She gave him the address, then added, "Though I'm curious, does your investigation also extend to the Singapore and Indonesian operations of Sterling Industries?" I have some documentation you might find quite interesting. There was a pause on the line. Ma'am, I'm just handling the initial contact. The investigating officers will discuss the scope with you when they arrive. I look forward to it. One more question, if I may. Does the name Azure Horizon mean anything to you? Another, longer pause. Not at this time. Please remain at your current location until officers arrive. After ending the call, Adeline turned to Charles. William is using the police to prevent me from attending the board meeting. They'll be here soon with a warrant. On what grounds? The same accusations he's planning to use against me with the board. He's trying to create a where there's smoke, there's fire situation. She stood, gathering her materials. We need to move now. Is the backup plan ready? Charles nodded grimly. Everything's in place, but William's raising the stakes considerably. Once we do this, there's no going back. There was no going back the moment he brought Madison to that dinner, Adeline replied, her resolve hardening. He wanted a war, now he's got one. As they prepared to leave through the law firm's service entrance, Adeline's phone buzzed with a text from James. Emergency. W found backup flash drive in your office, claiming definitive proof you were behind Indonesian fraud. Board members wavering. Meeting started early, followed immediately by another. He's going to win, Adeline. He has documentation with your signatures authorizing everything. How is that possible? Adeline stared at the messages in disbelief. William had somehow created fraudulent documentation with her signature, and he'd timed the police action perfectly to prevent her from defending herself at the board meeting. Charles, she said, her voice unnaturally calm, William just produced documents supposedly signed by me authorizing the Indonesian operations. How thoroughly did he think this through? The old lawyer's eyes widened. If he's forged your signature on backdated documents, then he's committed another crime we can prove. She straightened her shoulders. Call Judge Harriman directly. Tell him not to let the board vote on anything until I arrive. And Charles, tell him to record everything William says, every single word. As police sirens wailed in the distance, approaching the law offices, Adeline made her decision. William had played his hand, believing he'd checkmated her. But he'd forgotten one critical fact about his wife. Adeline Sterling never entered a battle she hadn't already calculated how to win, even if it meant temporarily appearing to lose. The Sterling Industries boardroom occupied the entire 50th floor of Sterling Tower, a testament to Richard Sterling's belief that major decisions deserved their own rarefied air. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, though today dark storm clouds gathered on the horizon, casting the gleaming room in ominous shadow. William Sterling stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, his expression one of grave concern as he addressed the 12 board members and key executives present. As difficult as this is for me personally, we cannot ignore the evidence before us, he said, gesturing to the documents being distributed. For months, I've noticed concerning patterns in my wife's behavior. Erratic decision-making, paranoid accusations, emotional instability. I attributed it to the natural strain of our personal situation. Victoria Sterling, seated to his right, maintained a carefully neutral expression, while James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Elizabeth Chen studied the psychiatric evaluation with obvious skepticism. However, William continued, when these financial irregularities came to light, I was forced to consider a more troubling possibility. The documentation is undeniable. Adeline has been using her position at the Sterling Foundation to authorize problematic operations while creating a paper trail implicating others. Judge Harriman leaned forward. These are serious allegations, William. Where is Adeline now? Shouldn't she have the opportunity to respond? I've been asking myself the same question, William replied with practiced concern. She disappeared this morning after I confronted her about these issues. My security team reports she's meeting with Charles Winthrop, presumably to construct some defense. The NYPD Financial Crimes Division has been notified and is currently searching for her to serve a warrant. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. Given the circumstances, I move that we temporarily suspend Adeline Sterling from all Sterling Industries operations, including the Foundation, pending full investigation. William nodded appreciatively. I take no pleasure in this, but for the company's protection. The boardroom doors burst open. Every head turned as two uniformed police officers entered, followed by Detective Frank Morgan. Behind them, Charles Winthrop stepped in, his expression grim but determined. William Sterling? Detective Morgan approached the head of the table. I need to speak with you regarding some allegations that have been brought to our attention. William's confident smile faltered only momentarily. Of course, Detective, though we're in the middle of a rather important meeting. Perhaps we could schedule— This won't wait, sir. Morgan turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but this matter concerns the business before you. William's jaw tightened. Whatever my wife has told you— Actually, a familiar voice cut in from the doorway, I haven't told the detective anything yet. Adeline Sterling entered the boardroom with measured steps, immaculately dressed in a navy suit that radiated authority. She carried a leather portfolio and was accompanied by a man in a dark suit whom no one recognized. Adeline, William recovered quickly. You've saved the detective some trouble finding you, though I wish you'd chosen a less dramatic moment to turn yourself in. Adeline smiled thinly. I'm not turning myself in, William. I've been cooperating with authorities, just not the ones you called. She gestured to the man beside her. This is Special Agent Thomas Ramirez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. The real one, not the local precinct detective you apparently persuaded to assist you. The blood drained from William's face as Detective Morgan stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, your call to our department claiming your wife was embezzling funds triggered several red flags in our system. When Mrs. Sterling mentioned Azure Horizon during our conversation, it matched an ongoing federal investigation. What federal investigation? William demanded, looking between the officers. This is absurd. My wife is clearly having some kind of breakdown. William, Charles Winthrop interrupted, I suggest you stop talking now. Anything you say in this room is being recorded with the permission of Judge Harriman, who as a board member has legal authority to consent to such recording in a corporate setting. Judge Harriman nodded grimly. I authorized the recording when Mr. Winthrop informed me of the seriousness of the allegations against both parties. William gripped the back of his chair, knuckles whitening. This is a desperate attempt by my wife to deflect from her own misconduct. I have documentation proving she authorized the Indonesian operations. Her signatures are on every critical document. That's what I'd like to discuss, Agent Ramirez said, placing his briefcase on the table. Mrs. Sterling approached the FBI 3 weeks ago with concerns about fraudulent documentation being created in her name. As a precautionary measure, we examined several recently submitted corporate filings. He pulled out a folder and removed several documents bearing Adeline's signature. Our forensic analysts identified these as sophisticated forgeries. The signatures were digitally transposed from legitimate documents and adjusted to match the dates in question. William's expression hardened. This is preposterous. You expect the board to believe my wife went to the FBI weeks ago, anticipating that I would produce evidence of her misdeeds? Not exactly, Adeline replied, taking control of the room with quiet confidence. I went to the FBI after discovering your Singapore operations 6 months ago. The offshore accounts, the money laundering, the connections to mining operations using forced labor, all of it meticulously documented. She opened her portfolio and began distributing files to each board member. The FBI has been building their case ever since with my full cooperation. The board members began examining the documents, murmurs of shock rippling around the table. Elizabeth Chen looked up first. These transfers, millions diverted through shell companies. This isn't just creative accounting, it's criminal. It was necessary, William snapped, his composure cracking. The regulatory environment in these regions makes conventional operations impossible. Every energy company does this. I just had the courage to maximize the opportunity. A collective intake of breath followed this inadvertent admission. Agent Ramirez raised an eyebrow, making a note in his small notebook. Adeline continued calmly. When William brought Madison Pierce to our family dinner and announced his intention to remove me from Sterling Industries, I realized he was accelerating his timeline. He needed me gone before the quarterly audit that would have revealed discrepancies I'd been quietly tracking. Victoria Sterling finally spoke, her voice cold with disappointment. Is this true, William? You deliberately humiliated Adeline to facilitate fraud? William's eyes darted around the room, calculating his remaining options. Mother, don't be naive. Dad built this company by taking risks. The only difference is that I had the vision to see bigger opportunities. Yes, I bent some rules. Show me a successful company that hasn't. He straightened, regaining some confidence. As for Madison, that was personal. Adeline failed to provide an heir for the Sterling legacy. I found someone who could. How convenient that she also signed whatever documents you put in front of her, Adeline observed. She understood business necessities, unlike you with your ethical hand-wringing. William turned to the board members. Everything I've done has been to increase shareholder value. The Indonesian and Singapore operations will double our profits within 2 years. At what cost? James asked quietly. The environmental reports you falsified. People are getting sick, Will, children. Acceptable losses in an emerging market, William replied dismissively. They'll be compensated eventually. Judge Harriman shook his head in disgust. Richard Sterling would never have authorized such operations. My father was weak. William's voice rose. He let sentimentality limit this company's potential. I've merely corrected his mistakes. Adeline met Victoria's eyes across the table, receiving a slight nod before she played her final card. Richard wasn't weak, William. He was principled, and far more strategic than you give him credit for. She removed a sealed document from her portfolio and handed it to Judge Harriman. This is the original codicil to Richard Sterling's will, maintained in safekeeping by Victoria Sterling until now. It establishes a special class of voting shares split between the CEO position and the Sterling Foundation, creating dual control over all major corporate decisions. As Judge Harriman verified the document, William's face contorted with rage. This is a forgery. My father gave me full control. I was there when he signed it, William, Victoria interrupted. 1 week before he died. He knew what you might become without proper checks on your authority. The judge looked up from his examination. The document appears authentic, with proper notarization and witnesses. If this is valid, and I believe it is, then William has been operating without proper authority for any major decisions since Richard's death. William slammed his fist on the table. This is absurd. I am Sterling Industries. I've tripled our market cap in 5 years, while secretly building a criminal enterprise that could destroy everything your father created, Adeline countered. She turned to the board. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. The evidence is before you, and the FBI investigation will continue regardless of what happens in this room today. What I'm asking is that you honor Richard Sterling's wish for proper governance of the company that bears his name. The elevator doors opened again, and Madison Pierce stepped into the boardroom, accompanied by Elizabeth Chen's assistant. Her face was pale but determined as she approached the table. William's expression shifted from rage to calculation. Madison, darling, I'm glad you're here. Adeline has been making some troubling claims. I need you to tell the board about her mental state these past few months. Madison met his gaze steadily. Actually, I'm here to confirm everything Adeline has said. What? William's voice dropped dangerously. I've provided the FBI with copies of every document you had me sign, William, including the ones you told me were routine authorizations that turned out to be approvals for bribing officials and falsifying environmental data. She placed protective hands over her pregnant belly. I won't let my child's father be someone who poisons other people's children for profit. William lunged toward her, his control finally shattering completely. You stupid bitch. Do you have any idea what you've done? 2 security officers immediately restrained him as Agent Ramirez stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you calm down immediately. Marcus Webb, seeing the way the wind was blowing, hurriedly distanced himself from his former ally. I had no knowledge of these illegal operations. William kept the full scope of these activities hidden from the financial team. That's a lie, William shouted, struggling against the security officers. Marcus authorized every transfer. He created the shell company structure. And that, Agent Ramirez said dryly, is why we recommend not speaking without an attorney present. He nodded to the officers. Take Mr. Webb into a separate room for questioning as well. As Marcus was escorted out, his face ashen, Victoria Sterling rose to her feet. Though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her voice remained steady. As the largest individual shareholder of Sterling Industries and widow of its founder, I move that the board vote immediately on the removal of William Sterling as CEO, based on evidence of criminal misconduct and violation of his fiduciary duty. Elizabeth Chen seconded the motion. And I move that we appoint an interim leadership committee headed by Adeline Sterling, pursuant to the authority granted in Richard Sterling's codicil, until a full investigation can be completed. Judge Harriman, now acting as interim chairman, called for the vote. Those in favor of removing William Sterling as CEO of Sterling Industries, effective immediately, one by one. hands raised around the table. James hesitated longest, conflict evident on his face as he looked at his brother, but ultimately he too raised his hand. "The motion passes unanimously," Judge Harriman announced. "William Sterling is hereby removed as Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Industries. Security will escort him from the premises after the authorities have completed their initial questioning." William's face contorted with hatred as he glared at Adeline. "You think you've won? This company is in my blood. You're nothing but an outsider who wormed her way in by seducing a dying old man's son." Adeline regarded him calmly. "Richard Sterling didn't trust you with his legacy, William. He trusted me. That's something your ego will never accept." As William was led away, still hurling threats and accusations, the room fell into stunned silence. The storm that had been gathering outside finally broke, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rumbled across the Manhattan skyline. Victoria approached Adeline, her aristocratic composure firmly back in place. "Richard would be proud of you today," she said quietly, "and ashamed of what his son became." Adeline squeezed the older woman's hand. "William isn't beyond redemption, Victoria. He needs to face consequences for his actions, but perhaps this will be the wake-up call he needs." Victoria's smile was sad. "You're kinder than I am, my dear. Always have been." She straightened her shoulders and addressed the remaining board members. "Now, shall we discuss how to move forward? Sterling Industries has survived crises before, and it will survive this one." As the board began the grim work of assessing the damage William had done, Adeline stepped aside with Madison, who looked exhausted by the confrontation. "Are you all right?" Adeline asked gently. Madison nodded. "I think so. It's just not how I imagined this would go when William and I first—" She trailed off, searching for words. "When you fell in love with him. Was it love?" Madison wondered aloud. "Or was I just another acquisition he thought would be useful?" She looked up at Adeline with new respect. "You saw through him from the beginning, didn't you?" "Not from the beginning," Adeline admitted. "I loved him once, very much. But William changed, or perhaps he finally revealed who he always was." Madison placed a hand on her belly as the baby kicked. "What happens now? To Sterling Industries? To William? To us?" "Sterling Industries will survive, though we have significant challenges ahead repairing the damage William has done." Adeline's voice grew firm with conviction. "As for William, he'll face legal consequences for his actions. How severe those are depends partly on whether he cooperates with authorities." She hesitated before addressing the most complicated question. "As for us, that's entirely up to you, Madison. Your child is a Sterling, regardless of what happens to William. If you want to be part of this family, there's a place for you. If you prefer distance from all of this, I'll ensure you and your child are taken care of." Tears filled Madison's eyes. "Why would you do that? After what I did, coming to that dinner, letting him use me to hurt you?" "Because that child is innocent," Adeline said simply, "and because I suspect you were as much a victim of William's manipulation as anyone." Before Madison could respond, Elizabeth Chen approached them. "I hate to interrupt, but the FBI needs formal statements from both of you, and we have some immediate damage control to implement before the markets open tomorrow." Adeline nodded, the weight of her new responsibilities settling on her shoulders. Sterling Industries faced its greatest crisis since its founding, and she now stood at its helm. The board's vote had removed William, but the harder work of rebuilding what he had damaged was just beginning. As she rejoined the board meeting, Adeline caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rain-streaked windows. For the first time in years, she didn't see William Sterling's perfect corporate wife staring back at her. Instead, she saw the woman Richard Sterling had recognized from the beginning, a leader worthy of his trust, capable of protecting his legacy when his own son could not. The storm continued to rage outside, but within Sterling Tower, a new era had begun. The first 72 hours after William's removal passed in a blur of crisis management. Adeline moved into the CEO's office, not William's lavish penthouse suite, but Richard Sterling's original office on the 49th floor, which had been preserved as a kind of corporate museum since his death. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone at Sterling Tower. "The markets are stabilizing," Elizabeth Chen reported, setting a tablet displaying real-time stock information on the desk between them. "We're still down 18% from last week, but the bleeding has stopped." Adeline nodded, scanning the numbers. The press conference she'd held the morning after William's removal had been a masterclass in corporate damage control. She'd been transparent about the discovery of financial improprieties, while emphasizing that the board had acted swiftly and decisively to address them. The fact that the FBI investigation had been initiated by Sterling Industries itself, technically true, as she was still a Sterling, had helped frame the narrative as one of corporate responsibility rather than corruption. The Asia markets are actually up 2% overnight, Elizabeth continued. Your pledge to properly remediate the Indonesian environmental damage is playing well internationally. The new ESG analysts are calling it a textbook example of corporate course correction. Have we received the preliminary assessment report yet? Adeline asked, pulling up another document on her screen. Dr. Lin's team arrived on site yesterday. Initial findings confirm what Madison's documents suggested: groundwater contamination exceeding safety standards by factors of 12 to 15 in some locations. Elizabeth's expression darkened. 3 nearby villages are showing elevated rates of respiratory conditions and skin disorders consistent with chemical exposure. Adeline closed her eyes briefly, centering herself against the wave of anger and guilt. Authorize whatever medical resources they need immediately, and begin planning for long-term remediation and community support programs. Already in motion, Elizabeth confirmed. The estimated cost is— I don't care what it costs, Adeline interrupted. Those people are suffering because Sterling Industries prioritized profit over safety. Make it right. A knock at the door heralded Charles Winthrop, who entered carrying a thick legal binder. The board has unanimously approved the new corporate governance structure, he announced, setting the document before Adeline. Dual leadership between you as CEO and James as COO, with enhanced board oversight for all international operations. And Victoria agreed to serve as board chair, though she insists it's temporary. Charles smiled slightly. I believe her exact words were, "Just until Adeline gets this mess sorted." Adeline signed the document, feeling the weight of Richard Sterling's legacy in every stroke of her pen. The restructured leadership reflected her belief that concentrated power, the kind William had wielded, inevitably led to corruption. The new Sterling Industries would be built on distributed authority and transparent decision-making. What's the latest on William? She asked, handing the signed documents back to Charles. The old lawyer's expression grew somber. He's been released on bail, $5 million, which Victoria provided. The judge restricted his travel and froze most of his assets pending trial, but he's moved into his Manhattan apartment. And he's already plotting his comeback, Elizabeth added, pulling up an email on her tablet. This came in 20 minutes ago, addressed to several board members. Adeline read the message, unsurprised by William's tactics. He was claiming that Adeline had orchestrated a coup motivated by jealousy over Madison, that the financial irregularities were standard industry practices that Adeline had selectively highlighted to seize control, and that the environmental issues in Indonesia had been exaggerated to manipulate public sentiment. Has anyone responded? She asked. Not yet, Elizabeth replied, but 3 board members forwarded it to me immediately, which I take as a good sign. And the others? Elizabeth hesitated. 2 haven't responded at all, which concerns me. Hansen and Fujimoto were always closer to William than to Richard. Adeline nodded, making a mental note to schedule one-on-one meetings with those board members. William would be working every angle to undermine her leadership, and she couldn't afford to leave any potential weakness unaddressed. What about Madison? She asked. Has William attempted contact? Multiple times, Charles confirmed. She's filed for a temporary restraining order, citing his outburst at the board meeting as evidence of potential threat. The court granted it this morning. Adeline absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Part of her, a part she wasn't entirely proud of, felt satisfaction at William's increasing isolation. But another part recognized the tragedy unfolding. A child would soon be born into this tangle of betrayal, legal battles, and corporate warfare. Madison's due date is in 6 weeks, she mused. We should ensure she has everything she needs. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. You're remarkably generous to the woman William paraded in front of you to cause maximum humiliation. Madison was a pawn in William's game, just as I was, Adeline replied. The difference is that I recognize the game for what it was. She's carrying a sterling heir, Richard's grandchild. Whatever happens with William, that child deserves our support. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Adeline's assistant announced Madison's arrival for their scheduled meeting. The pregnant woman who entered the office looked markedly different from the poised, sophisticated figure William had introduced at the family dinner. Without William's controlling influence, Madison had adopted a more natural style. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, makeup minimal, clothing comfortable rather than provocative. "Thank you for seeing me," Madison said, lowering herself carefully into the visitor's chair. "I know how busy you must be. You're always welcome here," Adeline assured her, signaling for Elizabeth and Charles to give them privacy. When the door closed behind them, she continued, "How are you feeling?" "Physically, like a beached whale." Madison managed a small smile. "Emotionally, that's complicated." She rubbed her belly absently. William's lawyer called again. "They want to discuss parental arrangements before the baby arrives." "And how do you feel about that?" Madison's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. Part of me wants to keep William as far away from this child as possible after everything I've learned. But another part feels guilty about depriving my baby of a father." Adeline handed her a tissue. "Whatever you decide, you'll have Sterling Industries' support, both professionally and personally. That's actually why I'm here." Madison dabbed at her eyes. "The FBI agent suggested I consider relocating after the baby is born, possibly with a new identity. They're concerned about potential retaliation from William or from some of his associates." "The people from Azure Horizon," Adeline surmised grimly. Madison nodded. "But the thing is, I don't want to disappear. I don't want my child growing up in hiding, always looking over their shoulder." She straightened in her chair, a new determination in her eyes. "I want to stay and testify against William. I want to help make things right with the people who were harmed in Indonesia." Adeline studied the younger woman with newfound respect. "That's a brave decision." "Is it brave or just right?" Madison asked quietly. "I signed those documents. I may not have understood exactly what they meant, but I chose not to ask too many questions when things didn't feel right. I'm not innocent in all this. Few of us are," Adeline admitted. "I suspected something was wrong with William's operations for months before I acted decisively. I told myself I needed more evidence, that confronting him prematurely would only drive the activities further underground. But part of me was also afraid of facing the truth about what my husband had become. This moment of shared vulnerability created a strange bond between the two women, both victims of William's manipulation in different ways, both now determined to rectify the damage he had caused. "I have a proposal," Adeline said suddenly. "Sterling Industries is establishing a new compliance and ethics division to prevent anything like this from happening again. With your business background and first-hand understanding of how these fraudulent schemes operated, you'd be an ideal consultant for that team." Madison looked surprised. "You'd trust me with that?" "I think you've earned that trust," Adeline replied. "Your cooperation with the FBI, your willingness to testify despite the personal cost, these show integrity. Besides, who better to help design safeguards than someone who's seen the vulnerabilities from the inside?" For the first time since they'd met, Madison smiled genuinely. "I'd like that very much." As Madison left the office, Adeline returned to the mountain of work before her. The Indonesian remediation plan needed approval. The Singapore operations had to be unwound legally without triggering additional regulatory investigations in multiple jurisdictions. The quarterly earnings report was due in 3 weeks, and she would need to present a clear vision for Sterling Industries' future that would reassure investors while acknowledging the serious issues being addressed. And beneath all the corporate challenges lay the personal ones: her pending divorce from William, the media scrutiny of her every move, and the fundamental question of who Adeline Sterling was now that she was no longer defining herself as William Sterling's perfect corporate wife. 2 weeks later, Adeline sat across from William for the first time since his removal as CEO. The meeting, arranged by their respective attorneys, took place in a neutral conference room at Charles Winthrop's law firm rather than at Sterling Tower. William had lost weight, his custom suit hanging slightly loose on his frame, but his eyes still held the same calculating intelligence, the same capacity for strategic thinking that had made him a formidable business leader and a dangerous adversary. "You're looking well, Adeline," he opened, his tone almost conversational. "Power suits you." "Thank you," she replied neutrally. "I appreciate you agreeing to this meeting. Did I have a choice? Your lawyers have rejected every settlement proposal my team has put forward. Because those proposals all involved you retaining significant control over Sterling Industries' operations, which is unacceptable given the circumstances. William leaned back in his chair, studying her. The circumstances being that you orchestrated my removal based on selective evidence and an outdated codicil my father signed while heavily medicated. Adeline didn't rise to the bait. We're not here to relitigate the board's decision, William. We're here to discuss a path forward that minimizes further damage to all parties. Ah yes, the greater good. Always your favorite refuge. His smile didn't reach his eyes. So what does this path forward look like in your vision, Adeline? Me surrendering all claims to my family's company, pleading guilty to spare Sterling Industries the embarrassment of a trial, perhaps a public apology for daring to run my business according to market realities rather than idealistic fantasies. Charles Winthrop cleared his throat warningly, but Adeline held up a hand to stop him from intervening. Actually, she said calmly, I'm offering you a chance at redemption. That seemed to catch William off guard. Redemption? How charmingly biblical. The federal prosecutors have indicated willingness to consider a plea agreement, Adeline continued, in exchange for your full cooperation in untangling the Singapore operations and identifying all parties involved in the Indonesian environmental fraud. They would recommend reduced charges focused on financial improprieties rather than the more serious environmental crimes. William's eyes narrowed. And what would this theoretical plea include for me? Probation, significant financial penalties, and a ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company for 10 years. Adeline met his gaze directly, but no prison time. A tense silence filled the room as William processed this offer. His attorney leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but William waved him off impatiently. And Sterling Industries. What happens to my ownership stake? Your Sterling Industries shares would be placed in a blind trust for the duration of the probation period, Adeline explained. You would receive dividend income, but have no voting rights or operational input, effectively neutering my influence while preserving the appearance that I remain a stakeholder, William summarized bitterly. And what about Madison and my child? That's between you and Madison, though any arrangement would need to respect the restraining order currently in place. Sterling Industries will ensure that your child receives all the benefits accorded to a Sterling heir, regardless of your legal status. William studied her with newfound intensity. Why are you doing this, Adeline? You've won. You have the company, the board's support, the moral high ground. Why offer me any lifeline at all? It was the question Adeline had been asking herself since formulating this proposal. The answer had come to her during a late-night conversation with Victoria, who had shared stories of a younger William. Brilliant, driven, but not yet corrupted by power and ambition. Because despite everything, you're still Richard Sterling's son, she said finally, and Richard believed in second chances. He believed that people could learn from their mistakes and become better. He never gave up on you, William, not even at the end. For a brief moment, something vulnerable flickered across William's face. Perhaps a glimpse of the man he might have been, had different choices been made. But it vanished quickly, replaced by his typical calculated expression. How touching, he said coolly, and completely transparent. You're not offering this out of some sentimental attachment to Richard's memory. You're doing it because a public trial would damage Sterling Industries, regardless of the outcome. The offer benefits all parties, Adeline acknowledged. That doesn't make it any less genuine. Richard taught me that the best solutions allow everyone to preserve their dignity. William laughed harshly. Dignity? You think there's dignity in becoming a corporate eunuch, watching from the sidelines as you dismantle everything I built? I think there's dignity in accountability, William. In acknowledging mistakes and working to correct them. Like the mistakes in Indonesia? Those villages with their convenient health problems that appeared right when you needed leverage against me? Charles Winthrop intervened sharply. That's enough, William. The environmental damage is extensively documented by independent experts. Attempting to deny it now only undermines whatever credibility you have left. William's jaw tightened, but he fell silent, perhaps recognizing he'd overplayed his hand. The offer remains open for 72 hours, Adeline said, rising from her chair. After that, the prosecutors will proceed with their full case, including the environmental crimes charges. As she gathered her belongings, William spoke again, his voice low and controlled. You know, Adeline, I underestimated you for years. I saw only what I wanted to see, the perfect corporate wife, the compassionate counterweight to my pragmatism. I never recognized the strategist hiding in plain sight. That was your mistake. she replied simply, not seeing people for who they truly are. And who are you truly, now that you've seized everything you wanted? Adeline paused at the door, considering the question seriously. I'm the woman your father trusted to protect his legacy. Nothing more, nothing less. William's bitter laugh followed her out of the room. We'll see how long that lasts, darling. Power changes everyone, even perfect Adeline. 3 weeks later, Madison Pierce gave birth to a healthy baby boy, 7 pounds, 9 ounces, with a shock of dark hair reminiscent of the Sterling family trait. She named him Richard Thomas Pierce, honoring the grandfather he would never know while omitting the Sterling name entirely, a decision that spoke volumes about her complicated relationship with the family he was born into. Adeline visited the hospital the day after the birth, bringing a small silver frame engraved with the baby's initials and birth date. Inside was a photograph of Richard Sterling on the day Sterling Tower opened, his proudest professional achievement. For when he's older, Adeline explained, setting the gift on Madison's bedside table, so he knows where he comes from regardless of the path he chooses. Madison, exhausted but radiant, held her sleeping son against her chest. William called. His lawyer requested a paternity test. That's his right, Adeline said carefully, though I don't think anyone who sees this child would question his parentage. It's not about confirmation, Madison said, stroking the baby's dark hair. It's about control, the first move in what will probably be years of legal maneuvers over Richard's future. You don't have to face that alone, Adeline reminded her. Sterling Industries' legal team is at your disposal, and Victoria has expressed interest in being involved in her grandson's life, independent of William's situation. Madison looked up with tired eyes. Why are you all being so kind to me, after everything that happened? Because that's what family does, Adeline said simply. And whatever complications exist between the adults in this situation, this child is family. The baby stirred and opened his eyes, dark blue like all newborns, but with an intensity that instantly reminded Adeline of the elder Richard Sterling. Looking at this innocent child, untouched by the complex web of betrayal, ambition, and redemption surrounding his birth, Adeline felt a renewed sense of purpose in her mission to rebuild Sterling Industries. This wasn't just about correcting William's mistakes or fulfilling Richard's legacy. It was about creating something worthy of this new generation, a company that would make little Richard proud to bear its name one day, should he choose to embrace his heritage. 6 months after William's removal, Sterling Industries held its annual shareholder meeting. Under Adeline's leadership, the company had weathered the crisis with remarkable resilience. The stock price had recovered to within 5% of its pre-scandal levels. The Indonesian remediation project was showing positive results, with affected communities receiving medical care and environmental restoration proceeding ahead of schedule. The Singapore operations had been unwound legally, with full cooperation from William as part of his plea agreement. William himself had largely disappeared from public view. After accepting the plea deal, which most legal analysts considered remarkably lenient given the scope of the crimes, he had retreated to the Sterling family compound in Connecticut, where he was serving his house arrest and probation period. The financial press had moved on to newer scandals, occasionally referencing the Sterling situation as a case study in corporate governance failure and recovery. Adeline stood at the podium in the Sterling Tower auditorium, addressing a packed room of investors, analysts, and media. 6 months ago, Sterling Industries faced an existential crisis, she began. The values upon which Richard Sterling built this company had been compromised. Trust had been broken, and real harm had been done to communities who relied on us to be responsible corporate citizens. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her as she continued. Today I can report that we have made significant progress in remedying those harms and rebuilding that trust. Our Indonesian environmental restoration project has become a model for corporate responsibility in crisis management. Our new governance structure has established safeguards to ensure that no single individual can ever again subvert the ethical foundations of this company. And our financial performance has demonstrated that doing business the right way is not just morally correct, it's economically sustainable. She presented the quarterly results, which exceeded analyst expectations in most categories. The new renewable energy initiatives, which William had sidelined in favor of more immediately profitable but questionable operations, were now centerpieces of Sterling Industries' growth strategy. The Sterling Foundation had expanded its work, focusing particularly on environmental justice in communities affected by industrial development. Looking to the future, Adeline concluded, Sterling Industries remains committed to Richard Sterling's founding vision, that profit and purpose can and must coexist, that business has a responsibility to the communities it serves, and that true success is measured not just in quarterly returns, but in generational impact. The applause was genuine and sustained. As Adeline stepped away from the podium, Victoria Sterling approached her, elegant as always in a tailored suit that nodded to her status as board chair without attempting to overshadow the CEO. "Masterfully done," Victoria murmured. "Richard would be proud." "Thank you," Adeline replied. "Have you visited William recently?" Victoria's expression tightened slightly. "Last weekend. He's adjusting. The restrictions chafe, of course, but I believe the isolation has forced him to reflect in ways he never would have otherwise." "And has he seen the baby?" "Twice, under supervised visitation. Madison has been remarkably generous in that regard, given the circumstances." Victoria hesitated. "He asks about you." Adeline raised an eyebrow. "William? I find that hard to believe." "Not directly, of course. He inquires about company leadership decisions and whether there have been any strategic missteps. But it's you he's really asking about." "Professional curiosity," Adeline dismissed, "or looking for weaknesses to exploit when his restrictions eventually end." Victoria studied her carefully. "Perhaps, or perhaps he's finally recognizing what he lost, not just the company, but you." Adeline didn't respond immediately. Her divorce from William had been finalized 3 months ago, a surprisingly straightforward process given the circumstances. With his legal troubles and the comprehensive prenuptial agreement Richard had insisted upon, William had little leverage to contest the settlement terms. "The man I married doesn't exist anymore, Victoria," she finally said. "If he ever did." "People can change, Adeline. Sometimes tragedy forces growth that would never happen otherwise." Before Adeline could respond, Elizabeth Chen approached with several major investors who wanted to discuss the upcoming expansion into sustainable battery technology. The conversation with Victoria remained unfinished, but her words lingered in Adeline's mind throughout the day. 2 weeks later, Adeline found herself driving to the Sterling family compound in Connecticut. She'd told herself it was a courtesy visit. As CEO, she should personally update the company's largest individual shareholder, despite his voting rights being held in trust, on major strategic decisions. In reality, she wasn't entirely sure why she had decided to see William face to face. The security guard at the gate checked her identification and made a call before allowing her to proceed up the long, winding driveway. The estate was beautiful in early autumn, the maple trees blazing with color against the backdrop of rolling hills. Richard had purchased this property decades ago, envisioning it as a family retreat where future generations of Sterlings would gather. William was waiting on the front steps as she parked, his casual attire, jeans and a sweater, a stark contrast to his former, impeccably tailored appearance. The electronic monitoring bracelet on his ankle was partially visible beneath the hem of his pants, a reminder of his restricted status. "Adeline," he greeted her, surprise evident in his voice despite having been notified of her arrival. "This is unexpected. I was in the area for a meeting with potential partners for the Battery Technology Initiative," she replied, the explanation sounding hollow even to her own ears. New Haven was nearly an hour away. William didn't challenge her pretext. "Would you like to come in? I can have Mrs. Harrington prepare some tea." The housekeeper had been with the Sterling family for over 20 years, one of the few constants in William's currently circumscribed life. Adeline nodded, following him into the grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier. The house felt different from when they had visited together during their marriage. William had always treated it as a showcase, entertaining corporate guests on the manicured grounds, hosting lavish weekend retreats for key executives and investors. Now, there was a quieter energy to the space, more lived in despite its grandeur. "You've redecorated," she observed, noting that many of the more ostentatious art pieces had been replaced with family photographs and simpler works. "Mother's influence," William explained, leading her to the sunroom overlooking the gardens. She thought the place needed humanizing, whatever that means. They sat in uncomfortable silence while Mrs. Harrington brought tea. When the housekeeper had withdrawn, William asked directly, "Why are you really here, Adeline?" She considered deflecting with corporate updates but decided on honesty instead. I'm not entirely sure. Victoria mentioned you'd been asking about the company. I thought perhaps we should talk directly, now that some time has passed. William's mouth twisted in a half-smile. Checking to see if your corporate prisoner is plotting revenge from his gilded cage. Are you? Would I tell you if I was? He sipped his tea, studying her over the rim of the cup. You look well. Leadership clearly agrees with you. It's challenging, she admitted, but fulfilling in ways I hadn't anticipated. The stock price has recovered nicely. The Indonesian situation seems contained. Madison reports that the new compliance structure is robust. William set down his cup. You've done well, Adeline, better than I expected. Coming from William, this was as close to a compliment as she was likely to get. Thank you. That means something. Coming from you. Does it? His eyes sharpened with interest. I would have thought my opinion had become irrelevant to you. Your business acumen was never in question, William. It was your methods that created problems. Ah, yes, my moral failings. He leaned back in his chair. Have you come to see if I've reformed? Found Jesus in my comfortable exile? Developed a conscience befitting the sterling name? The edge in his voice was familiar, the defensive sarcasm he'd always employed when feeling vulnerable. Adeline chose not to rise to it. I came because, despite everything, we were partners for 10 years. Because we built something together, even if it ended badly. And because I thought you might want an honest conversation with someone who isn't legally obligated to report your every word to prosecutors. William studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh her sincerity. Finally, his posture relaxed slightly. The house arrest is wearing on me, he admitted. Not the physical restrictions so much as the isolation. People I considered friends haven't returned my calls since the plea agreement was announced. Fair weather friends, Adeline commented. Richard always warned about those. Father warned about many things. I should have listened more carefully. William gazed out at the gardens, now fading with the approach of winter. I've had a lot of time to think these past months, about what I built, what I broke, what I lost. Adeline remained silent, allowing him space to continue. I've seen the baby twice, he said after a pause. Richard Thomas. He looks like a sterling. Yes, he does, Adeline agreed softly. Madison says she's open to me having a relationship with him eventually. Supervised, of course. Once I've demonstrated that I can be trustworthy. He almost stumbled over the word, as if the concept of having to earn trust was still foreign to him. That's generous of her. It is. William looked back at Adeline. She speaks highly of you, you know. Says you've been supportive beyond anything she could have expected. Why would you do that, Adeline? After how I used her to hurt you? It was the question Victoria had asked that Elizabeth had wondered, that Adeline herself had examined during sleepless nights. The answer came to her with surprising clarity. Because compassion isn't a zero-sum game, William. Being kind to Madison and her son doesn't diminish me or excuse your actions. It's simply the right thing to do. William shook his head slowly. You really believe that, don't you? That doing the right thing matters more than winning? I believe they're not mutually exclusive, she corrected. Sterling Industries is stronger now because we've embraced ethical operations, not despite it. The market has responded positively to our transparency in addressing the Indonesian situation. Our new governance structure has attracted investors who value long-term sustainability over short-term gains. A convenient alignment of virtue and profit, William observed dryly. Richard would be delighted to see his philosophy validated so neatly. It's not always neat, Adeline admitted. There are hard decisions, compromises, competing priorities, but the foundation matters, William. The values we build upon determine what can stand the test of time. Something shifted in William's expression, not quite acceptance, but perhaps a willingness to consider perspectives he would have dismissed outright months earlier. I've been reviewing some of Father's early business journals, he said, gesturing to a leather-bound book on a nearby table, from when he was first transitioning the company toward renewable energy. The opposition he faced, the risks he took. I never fully appreciated the courage that required. He was a visionary, Adeline agreed. He saw where the industry needed to go before most of his contemporaries. And I was so focused on proving I could outperform him that I compromised everything he valued. William's admission hung in the air between them, perhaps the most honest self-assessment he'd ever voiced in her presence. As the afternoon light began to fade, their conversation shifted to less fraught topics. the battery technology initiative Adeline was spearheading, Victoria's unexpected skill as board chair, James's growing confidence as COO. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was a kind of armistice, an acknowledgement that despite everything that had happened, they shared a history and a connection to Sterling Industries that transcended their failed marriage. When Adeline finally rose to leave, William walked her to her car. The electronic monitor on his ankle beeped softly as they approached the invisible boundary of his permitted area. "Will you come again?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "To update me on company developments, of course." Adeline considered her answer carefully. "Yes, I think I will. Quarterly, perhaps, to coincide with the major business cycles." William nodded, accepting these terms. As she opened her car door, he added, "Adeline, for whatever it's worth, I'm sorry, not just for the company, but for us. For what I destroyed." The words seemed to cost him something to say, a crack in the armor of arrogance and entitlement he'd worn for so long. It wasn't a complete transformation, and Adeline harbored no illusions that the old William was entirely gone. But it was, perhaps, a beginning. "Thank you for saying that," she replied simply. "Goodbye, William." As she drove away, Adeline glanced in her rearview mirror. William Sterling, former CEO, disgraced executive, her ex-husband, stood watching her departure, a solitary figure framed by the grand house that now served as both his sanctuary and his prison. The road ahead curved through the autumn landscape, leading back to Sterling Tower and the rebuilding work that continued there. Whatever William's future held, redemption, reformation, or merely resignation to his diminished circumstances, Adeline's path was clear. She would honor Richard Sterling's legacy by leading with both strength and compassion, ensuring that Sterling Industries remained true to its founding principles while adapting to a changing world. And perhaps in time, the wounds of betrayal would heal enough that William could find a meaningful place within the Sterling family again, not as the leader he once was, but as someone who had learned the hard lessons of hubris and was trying, however imperfectly, to become better. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left slightly ajar, a possibility that even the most broken relationships might someday find their way to reconciliation. 2 years later, the terrace of Adeline Sterling's Manhattan penthouse offered a breathtaking view of Central Park in spring bloom. Gathered for young Richard's second birthday celebration, the unlikely assembly represented the new reality of the Sterling family, reimagined and restructured just as Sterling Industries had been. Little Richard tottered across the terrace on unsteady legs, his dark hair and intense gaze unmistakably Sterling, despite the Pierce surname he carried. Madison watched her son proudly, her transformation from William's manipulated mistress to respected professional complete. As Director of Ethics and Compliance at Sterling Industries, she had helped design safeguards that industry publications now cited as the gold standard. Victoria Sterling, elegantly composed even at 74, supervised the birthday cake preparation, while James and his wife Catherine entertained their own children alongside Richard. The scene radiated domestic warmth, a stark contrast to the stilted formality that had characterized Sterling family gatherings during William's reign. Adeline observed it all from a quiet corner, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Sterling Industries had not merely survived the crisis of William's tenure, it had emerged stronger, more transparent, and more committed to Richard Sterling's original vision than ever before. Quite the family portrait," Elizabeth Chen commented, joining Adeline with 2 glasses of champagne. Not exactly what anyone would have predicted 2 years ago. "Life rarely follows predictable paths," Adeline replied, accepting the offered glass. Speaking of unpredictable, the board approved the acquisition unanimously. Azure Horizon is officially a Sterling Industries subsidiary as of this morning. A smile of grim satisfaction crossed Adeline's face. And the audit? Completed last week. Every client, every operation, every offshore account identified and documented. Elizabeth's expression hardened, including the evidence that William was indeed using them for problem-solving beyond financial manipulation. Adeline nodded, having anticipated this confirmation. Azure Horizon, the shadowy firm William had employed for his dirtiest work, had been hemorrhaging clients since Sterling Industries' scandal broke. When their stock price plummeted, Adeline had quietly begun acquiring shares through a series of shell companies, culminating in yesterday's controlling interest purchase. What happens to that evidence now? Elizabeth asked quietly. It goes to the federal prosecutors, Adeline replied, as per our legal obligation upon discovering potential criminal activity. Elizabeth studied her carefully. This was your plan all along, wasn't it? The quarterly visits to William, the apparent thawing of relations, the hints that his eventual return to some role at Sterling might be possible. It was all to keep him complacent while you hunted down every last connection to his criminal activities. William taught me an important lesson, Adeline said, her voice cool and controlled. Never announce your strategy until the game is won. Across the terrace, Madison approached with little Richard in her arms. Are we interrupting? Not at all, Adeline smiled, her demeanor softening immediately. I think this birthday boy is owed a present from his godmother. Richard reached for Adeline with complete trust, his chubby hands grabbing at her pearl necklace, the same one that had belonged to Richard Sterling's mother, which Adeline now wore as a talisman of the legacy she protected. You've become his favorite person, Madison observed. It's like he senses the connection. Children often see what adults miss, Victoria commented, joining them. Richard always said a Sterling knows their own. The celebration continued into the evening, warm and genuine despite the undercurrent of calculated justice that Adeline and Elizabeth alone understood. As the family departed and the caterers cleared away the remnants of the party, Adeline's phone vibrated with an incoming call. Charles, she answered, moving to the privacy of her home office. I assume the papers have been served. 20 minutes ago, the aging lawyer confirmed. The federal marshals took William into custody immediately. The additional charges are significant: conspiracy, witness tampering, and evidence suggesting involvement in physical intimidation of environmental activists in Indonesia. How did he take it? Not well. He seemed genuinely shocked, kept insisting there must be some mistake, that you couldn't possibly be behind this. Adeline gazed out at the darkening Manhattan skyline, the weight of her actions settling around her shoulders. He never did see me clearly, not once in all our years together. The prosecutors are offering no deal this time, Charles continued. With the Azure Horizon evidence, they're confident of a conviction that will carry substantial prison time. I see. Her voice betrayed no emotion, though her grip on the phone tightened. Thank you for handling this, Charles. We'll speak tomorrow about the press strategy. After ending the call, Adeline remained at the window, watching the city lights emerge against the twilight. The Sterling Tower stood prominently in the skyline, its distinctive architecture a testament to Richard Sterling's vision, now preserved and expanded under her leadership. The sound of the terrace door sliding open broke her reverie. Victoria Sterling entered the office, her expression grave. It's done, isn't it? The older woman asked without preamble. William's final fall. Adeline turned, surprised. You knew. I suspected, Victoria corrected. You've been too accommodating these past months, too willing to consider William's eventual rehabilitation. It wasn't like you to leave such a dangerous loose end. And you're not angry? Adeline asked carefully. Victoria sighed, the weight of maternal disappointment evident in her bearing. My son made his choices, Adeline. Choices that dishonored his father's legacy and hurt countless innocent people. Whatever happens now, he earned through his own actions. She moved to stand beside Adeline at the window, both women silhouetted against the city lights. Richard chose well when he placed his trust in you. Not in William, not even in James, but in you, someone who understood that legacy isn't about names or bloodlines, but values. I never wanted it to end this way, Adeline admitted, allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability. There was a time when I truly loved him, when I believed in our partnership. I know. Victoria placed a hand on Adeline's arm. But you did what was necessary to protect Sterling Industries and everything it stands for. After Victoria departed, Adeline remained in her office contemplating the weight of victory. The Sterling Empire was secure, ethically realigned, financially thriving, its future bright under her stewardship. William would never again threaten what she had rebuilt from the ashes of his corruption. Yet success carried its own burdens. The calculated patience it had required to dismantle William's remaining defenses, the cold strategic thinking behind her apparent reconciliation, these had exacted an emotional toll she rarely acknowledged. In becoming the leader Sterling Industries needed, she had embraced aspects of herself that mirrored William's calculating nature, if not his moral bankruptcy. From her desk drawer, Adeline removed a photograph she kept hidden from visitors. Her wedding day with William, both of them young and genuinely happy, before ambition and power had corrupted what they might have been together. For a moment, she allowed herself to mourn what had been lost. Then, decisively, she returned the photograph to its drawer. The past was immutable, but the future remained open with possibility. Sterling Industries now employed thousands, impacted millions through its initiatives, and stood as a model of corporate responsibility. Little Richard would grow up in a family reshaped by crisis, but strengthened by principle. Madison had found her voice and purpose. Even Victoria had discovered new purpose as board chair, guiding the company's governance with wisdom born from painful experience. These were the victories that mattered, not the satisfaction of William's final defeat, but the reconstruction that had risen from the wreckage of his betrayal. Adeline Sterling walked back onto the terrace, breathing in the spring night air. Tomorrow would bring press inquiries, market reactions, and the thousand details of managing a corporate crisis. Tonight, however, belonged to reflection on how far she had come from the carefully cultivated corporate wife William had married. The Sterling legacy rested in her hands now, not because she had married into it, but because she had fought for it, protected it, and ultimately proven herself its most worthy steward. Richard Sterling had seen this potential in her from the beginning. William had recognized it too late, only when it became the instrument of his downfall. As Manhattan glittered before her, Adeline raised her champagne glass in a solitary toast. "To you, Richard," she whispered to the memory of her father-in-law. "The legacy stands, the Sterling standard endures." Beyond the city lights, a new day approached, bringing with it fresh challenges and opportunities for the company now unmistakably shaped in Adeline Sterling's image, principled but pragmatic, compassionate but unflinching, and above all, resilient enough to weather whatever storms the future might hold. The game was indeed over. In the complex chess match that had begun the night William brought Madison to the family dinner, Adeline had achieved more than mere victory. She had transformed the board entirely, creating something stronger and more enduring than what had existed before. Checkmate. If this story touched your heart, and you want to keep following inspiring and moving stories, be sure to check out our upcoming videos. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on new content that can brighten your journey and provide valuable insights. Join us and keep exploring stories that truly matter. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will touch you as well, so click on it now and we'll see you there.